Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker for this evening's lecture and book launch, Farshid Moussavi. Her book is titled The Function of Style and is the third in her series called The Function of, which all investigate the role of affect in contemporary architecture in different ways. Born in Iran, she moved to London in 1979 and has since built projects and given lectures all over the world. I think part of the reason Farshid has been such a huge inspiration to so many at an international level is her ability to investigate architecture through multiple lines of inquiry in parallel. She moves seamlessly between practice, writing, and teaching, where each medium informs the other, leading to a very rich conversation about what contemporary architecture means today, ranging from topics such as the diagram and information technology to landscape and building envelopes. Starting with her practice, she was co-founder of Foreign Office Architects, FOA, which in 1995 beat 795 other entrants to win the competition to design the Yokohama International Ferry Terminal in Japan, resulting in one of the most important landform buildings today. FOA's work has been widely published, and the firm has received many awards, including the Enrique Morales Prize for Architecture, 6 RIBA awards, the 2004 Venice Architecture Biennale Award, and the Charles Jenks Award for Architecture. In 2011, she founded the London-based architecture practice Farshid Moussavi Architecture, FMA. Among its completed projects are the acclaimed Cleveland Museum of Contemporary Art in Ohio, the 13th Venice Architecture Biennale installation Architecture and Its Effects, and the Victoria Beckham flagship store in London. Because most clothes are bought online, it's interesting that the store is conceived like a gallery, and she insightfully explains the more we have the internet, the more physical space becomes powerful. Bridging between theory and practice, FMA has a research arm called Function Lab, whose projects are developed in tandem to FMA's building commissions in order to create a feedback loop between practice and research. Her research projects include a new approach to ornament in retail typologies, the creation of different structural systems using digital design tools, and alternatives to the white cube galleries to cater for different art forms. Alongside practice and theory, Farshid has a long-standing commitment to the academic world. She trained at Harvard Graduate School of Design, University College, London, and Dundee University. She has taught at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, here at the Architectural Association in the 90s, and the Balaga Institute, Columbia, Princeton, and UCLA, among many others. Since 2006, she has been a professor in the practice of architecture at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Her public presence, created through international lecturing and practicing, is reinforced through her role as a trustee of the Whitechapel Art Gallery, the Architecture Foundation, and as a member of the steering committee of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. Combining her research at FMA's Function Lab and her teaching at Harvard, she has published 3 books: The Function of Ornament, which proposes that ornament has always carried a function, that function being aesthetic and cultural production; The Function of Forms, which proposes a new theory of form based on systems of repetition and differentiation in order to nurture the multiplicity and continuous change within today's culture. And now, The Function of Style, which asks, what is the function of style today? After postmodernism in the 1970s and deconstruction in the 1980s, she asks, how can we define architecture since the 1990s, where apparently everything goes? Curves and angles, singular and multiple forms, open and closed typologies, heavy and lightweight tectonics. Farshid explores how this diversity is not driven by external forces, but actually is a delicate, interconnected web of singular styles which have been appropriated from other buildings to reflect the structures of our everyday life. And we look forward to hearing more about this tonight. The Function of Style will be available to purchase in the South Jury Room after the lecture, and Farshid will be around to sign some copies. So please join me in warmly welcoming Farshid Moussavi.
Thank you for this very extensive and generous introduction. Let me begin to, first of all, tell you how glad I am to be back at the AA. Firstly, because the AA was a fertile ground to begin my academic career. It started here. Secondly, because I continue to share the AA's commitment, an interest in grounding its collective activity, not in a unified way of approaching architecture, but a multiplicity of ways. And thirdly, because despite this multiplicity, the units at the AA assume a shared agenda that is embracing experimentation and shifts in architectural conventions, or we could say reconfiguring architecture as a political issue grounded in the practice of everyday life. So I can't really think of a better place to present the style book, which approaches the question of style through the lens of multiplicity, shifting of conventions, and micropolitics. So let's begin. So as you know, the title of the talk is The Function of Style. But before talking about its function and how it can be a shared approach to architecture, which is really the subject of the book, let me first say that by function, I mean agency, not utility. So when considering the function of style, we are asking what is the function of style of buildings as objects in everyday life. The relationship between objects and subjects in everyday life is usually discussed in terms of the agency of human subjects. The field of phenomenology, for instance, has concerned itself with how people gain access to the being of objects, but objects themselves are not usually considered to have agency. Just this pre-existing being, like the matter they're composed of, the natural laws they're governed by, or their metaphysical origins, such as God. Although more recent investigations into everyday experience question the privileging of people over objects in everyday life. I'm thinking of speculative realism, suggestion of flattening of objects and subjects. They still treat objects as given and without agency or function of their own. But of course, the difference between these objects and architectural objects or buildings is that buildings don't exist as ready-made. They are arranged through the architectural process. This process of arranging buildings is what determines its style. This is why style is so central to the discussion of agency of buildings in everyday life. Traditionally, style has been the word employed to describe a single narrative around which architects unite buildings. But if this is the case, we might be inclined to say that architecture today has no style, because it's hard to identify any unifying narrative in a built environment characterized by immense diversity. Indeed, some do say that, hence the manifestos, which try to remedy architecture's apparent lack of coherence through proposing a grand new unifying style. But is this diversity really no style, just the product of eclecticism or the market, or is it the problem that our existing definition of style is too outdated to be able to identify an underlying coherence which already exists? Since the 1990s, three pivotal changes in the way buildings are designed and experienced force us to question how we define style today. Firstly, because buildings today face many challenges that are separate, distinct, and irreconcilable. These have led to different coefficients for buildings, such as space planning, security, rights of light, fire engineering, sustainability engineering, facade engineering, or health and safety, that are often beyond the expertise of the architect, requiring specialist consultants. The design process has therefore changed from a solo activity into more of a team sport, in which the different coefficients are the product of separate and concurrent lines of development that unfold at different speeds during the design process and introduce much unpredictability to it. Different building elements, no matter how large or small, are consequently vital forces for the project, some crossing paths with one another and others not, whose ability to address specific concerns would be compromised by attempts to resolve them into a single unifying narrative. Secondly, the advent of the internet. With the advent of the internet, the way architectural ideas are made is different, since ideas are now shared and circulated worldwide with astonishing speed, often apprehended unconsciously, and architects are so steeped in each other's theoretical ideas and anxieties that certainty of what belongs to one person and what to another disintegrates. And thirdly, again because of the internet, the way buildings are experienced has changed, since many everyday activities and events that used to happen in buildings, such as shopping, reading a book, or watching a match, are now easily accessed online. But since these online activities are reduced to the uniform context of a screen, independent of time and space, their experience has become very similar, whether reading different books or buying an item of clothing or watching a sports match. To complement the uniformity and the ubiquity of engaging with everyday activities online, buildings have started to exploit their unique spatio-temporal natures to generate the possibility for diverse types of encounters with people and the activities which buildings house. For example, libraries, in the wake of e-books, have changed from being inward-looking book repositories on the left, solely for quietly taking out and consuming books, to open and differentiated spaces that encourage people to construct diverse reading and learning habits and new forms of communication, while schools, responding to the fact that information can be shared online and accessed online, have shifted from generic tutor-focused classrooms that favor the transmission and reception of standard knowledge to unique, differentiated configurations that promote different kinds of experience-based learning. And department stores, responding to the rise of e-tailing, have shifted from hermetic environments whose sole objective is the provision of goods to acting as places in which the physical experience of shopping is site-specific, so that buying an item in one store is unlike buying it in any other, while offices, rather than declining in the face of email and conference calling, have changed from one-size-fits-all tailorist arrangements to create efficiency to include different types of interstitial spaces that promote knowledge construction through chance encounters and serendipitous knowledge exchange. Therefore, the agency of buildings, or their ability to act, resides in how their actual presence informs people's experience of everyday life activities and thereby makes a creative contribution to everyday life. To think of style in relation to people's everyday life encounters with the building, rather than their understanding of the narrative underlying it, is to deviate it from the traditional uses of style to unite buildings to represent the personality of its architect or author. Raphael Moneo has written about strategies by which he means mechanisms, procedures, paradigms, and formal devices that recur in the work of architects and define their personal domain, or to use style to unite buildings to represent their geographical location. For example, Bannister Fletcher proposed that the evolution of architecture was influenced by diverse factors that ultimately were rooted in nationality, or to use style to unite buildings to represent the time it belongs to, which Riegel and later Wolf Flynn and Henry Russell Hitchcock described as Kunstwollen, or the artistic impulse of a given race, nation, or age. Alternative to this definition of style as the representation of external narratives has been style as the representation of an autonomous system that unites the different parts of a building using a single formal order to represent a unified organic whole. We can think of Viollet-le-Duc, Bottice, functionalism, Frank Lloyd Wright were some of the people who were promoting this idea of style. We need to question if these uses of style are not redundant today. For a start, should style strive for unity? No. Unity applied across a group of buildings implies that the actual presence of a building or individual parts of them play no unique part in people's everyday life experience, but rather provide them with the same experience as all other buildings or all other parts. While trying to formally unite all elements of a building compromises their ability to simultaneously address distinct and separate concerns. to engage the elements as different vital forces or agents, style needs to account not for their unity, but multiplicity. In other words, for how the elements can be both formally equal and enmeshed with one another to simultaneously address different concerns. Should style represent authorship? No, today architectural ideas exist as an open source. The overzealous protection of an architect's ideas as signature or autonomous domain inhibits the migration and circulation of ideas and the consequent development of new ones, rethinking what is now labeled as copying or imitation, as sharing from a common pool, as often done in the field of music, will allow us to detach style from being fixed to an author and treat it like an open source or rhythm, which has no beginning or end. It is always in the middle, constantly evolving in different directions by different architects. Should style represent nationality? No, because in today's world of free trade, increased mobility of capital, the rise of transnational corporations, and the increased mobility of technologies, materials, and designers, strict boundaries between nations have been eroded, like the style of the modern bicycle that has evolved in the hands of many nations ever since its inception. We need to approach style of buildings through the idea of singularity, that any style can be adopted by any nation and changed to generate new, unpredictable styles. Should style represent a period of time? No, because time is not divided into periods in which everything is fixed or frozen. Today, as I mentioned earlier, buildings are subject to different external and often conflictual causes, which means that they evolve through separate, equal, and concurrent lines of development that unfold at different speeds throughout the design process, which may take anything from 1 to 6 years. Enhanced levels of security may require imminent changes to the entry sequence of a building early in the process, whereas new environmental regulations may necessitate changes to the envelope design midway through the process, and the election of a new mayor every 4 years could imply change in the space program, a budgetary change, or even a building location. The organicist model in which each element or part obediently serves the whole in a vacuum is clearly out. Like the M16 rifle, the challenge for an architect today is to conceive of buildings not as a unified whole, but as a confederation of elements, which we can call an assemblage or manifold, with a particular kind of arrangement and grouping that introduces an effectivity proper to them without restricting the independence of the elements so that they can be changed during the design process. Having discarded the representational narratives that historically define style, what remains in people's experience of buildings is their raw presence, or thisness, with their diverse individual elements, colors, textures, shapes, and forms that they produce. This may seem like limitations, but in fact, for the architect, they hold the secret to a new way of working, in which the ever-increasing number of elements buildings are divided into can be assembled without the constraints of representation, freed of representation, rather than a building's elements or parts being combined into a unified whole. They can be given their own internal disciplines, so that their combined assemblage can be coherent and a complex form. In this new way of working, individual elements or parts thus have a distinct propensity, which manifests itself as a cluster of affects. Affect, as used in the philosophy of Spinoza and elaborated by Bergson and Deleuze and Guattari, describes intensities that are transmitted by objects or bodies as a result of how they are assembled. An affect leads to an augmentation or diminution in the body's capacity to act. It plays an important role in determining the relationship between our bodies and our environment and others. A gate introduced within the perimeter wall of a building may transmit affects of closure and traversability. The asymmetric location of a window in a bedroom may transmit affects of invisibility and openness. Full-height glazing of hotel rooms may transmit affects of transparency and exposure. Handrails located around museum exhibits may transmit affects of visibility and untouchability, or skylights in a train station may transmit affects of transparency as well as protection. In this new way of working, the question of agency is therefore not located in what a building style represents, but in what way its affects engage people in their everyday lives. Here, for instance, is the Smithsonian East Wing by I.M. Pei, where unlike on the inside of the museum, where people are discouraged from touching its precious artifacts, the exterior of the museum is designed with blade-like corners, whose affect of sharpness is so inviting to touch that visitors have partly worn their edges away. Similarly, the Guggenheim Museum, the affect of lowness of the handrail, invites people to recline on it, with the result that people who might otherwise pass through its ramping galleries as if they were walking along the aisles of a supermarket stop and lean on the handrail while they look at the art. While in the case of this Cineplex, designed by my previous practice FOA, the cluster of affects of reflectivity, glare, and deformation transmitted by its mirror stainless steel cladding means that rather than ignoring the Cineplex, as is often the case with such inward-looking buildings, at a couple of points around the building, passers-by stop and salute the building systematically, no matter what sex or age. There is no reason why people should respect this building. This was certainly not part of our brief from the client, nor was it a cultural response that we hope to evoke. Rather, like the handrails which both stop people falling into the Guggenheim atrium and skew the conventions around the encounter, art encounter, or the walls which both shield the Smithsonian galleries from the elements and free people from the protective separateness which usually characterizes the gallery encounter. The envelope of the Cineplex is a consequence of the practical demands for dark interiors, as well as the desire to generate affects that would disrupt people's habitual way of engaging with this kind of building in the city. What's going on here cannot be reduced either to the agency of the objects or the passers-by subjectivities. It is produced by them. Together, it is caused by through their encounter. The traditional representational approach to style assumes that there is a direct road between the act of looking at a building and the fact of understanding, which we know doesn't exist. Recognizing that the aesthetic experience or encounter between people and buildings is a co-production brings us closer to a non-anthropocentric conception of agency. That is, when different people with their own unique subject positions come into contact with a building, they encounter some or all of its affects, which results from how its elements are styled or arranged. For example, a residential building may transmit affects of flexibility, transparency, and differentiation inside, and scalelessness and privacy outside. Some people may only experience the building as passers-by, and others who live in it would encounter many more of its affects. Through these encounters, people construct their own unique experience-based knowledge of the world. Therefore, we can define style in the following way. Style is the agency given to the elements of a building through their specific arrangement. It manifests itself as a cluster of affects that spreads out directly from the building and influences the kind of assemblage people will form with it as they take part in their everyday activities, like residing or working. In everyday, if those activities are arranged in the same way time after time, people become habituated to certain ways of engaging with them, as though there was no choice in the matter. Consider the interior of a cinema. When a certain way of arranging one of its elements, like its seats, is repeated over and over again, a convention emerges. The activity of watching movies in this way, this seating arrangement dictates, acquires a naturalness, so that people begin to watch movies in this way unthinkingly. Whereas if the convention of seating arrangement is shifted, then the arrangement of its elements or its style of the cinema no longer conforms to people's expectations, and even if it is just for a brief moment, a sense of surprise or possibility or freedom opens up. But the shift I'm referring to is not like the avant-garde strategies of estrangement or subversion, which would aim at subverting or in some way disturbing the relationship between people and a cinema by creating a distance between them and the habits which constrain them. The shifts of convention I'm referring to requires appropriating the cinema conventions rather than negating them in order to produce a new state of awareness about the cinema, a process that requires the efficacy or the creative agency of the architect. Here is the Yokohama Passenger Port Terminal, a project where we as architects shifted a number of conventions that influence how people typically engage with a ferry terminal. Instead of the conventional or dominant way of arranging the terminal around the linear circulation route to simply move passengers as directly as possible to the gates, which reduces his experience simply into a thoroughfare, we designed it with a looped circulation system through bifurcating terminal floors, which seamlessly connect people to levels above and below, to free them from the habit of passively passing through it so that they might choose it as a place to sit down and paint. Therefore, by shifting the conventions associated with a building for traveling, we generated a new presence or style for the ferry terminal that loosens the building's traditional relationship with traveling and allows people to freely or creatively respond to it. Now, the philosopher Jacques Rancière argues that the significance of aesthetics lies in the fact that what can be apprehended by the senses determines the possibilities for the participation of individuals in everyday life. For Rancière, politics is a disruption or a dissensus in conventionally perceived or prescribed spaces to make that which did not possess grounds to be seen, seen, so that active participation replaces active encounters replaces passive participation. So we could say that by making the conventions of how everyday activities are arranged unfamiliar, architects open up possibilities for the way bodies of individuals are supposed to fit those activities, and in doing so, ground style in the micropolitics of everyday life. I don't know why this is not. To adopt this approach to style, it is necessary to address it not as a representation, but a performance. So what is the effect of this approach on the process of design? This is a residential complex we are designing for the city of Montpellier in the south of France, where we have focused its style or arrangement of its elements on shifting certain conventions that would influence people's experience of residing in a communal building. The core, through its layout and location, is the agent determining the privacy or intrusion people experience on their way to their apartments. The floor plates, owing to their size and shape, are the agents determining the size and number of units on any one floor and the number of orientations afforded by each, and therefore whether residents experience natural ventilation or stuffiness. The location of the service risers, core and structure, is the agent determining the level of flexibility or inflexibility residents experience over time as the need to reconfigure their apartments arises. And the relationship between the floor plate, the envelope, and the handrail is the agent determining the privacy or exposure residents experience on their balconies. So you can see that to simultaneously assume different agencies, the building elements cannot be governed by a unifying formal idea. They must be considered as formally equal and arranged as an assemblage, so that each element, by virtue of its location and grouping with other elements, generates an emergent property, a new affect, whose effectivity is providing people with a new way of residing in such a building. The structure, core, and service rises form one group of elements. The floor plates and envelope form another group of elements. And the floor plates and handrail form another group of elements. And here is how the group performs. The core and service rises are centrally located and coupled with structural walls along the perimeter envelope. This generates an interior that transmits flexibility and is liberated of any fixed elements. The external envelope is inset to generate balconies, and the remainder of the floor plate is divided into 4 corner units that benefit from cross-ventilation. Since these outdoor spaces would abut each other, it would be usual for dividing screens to be introduced, or since dividing screens limit views laterally, their shape might be changed from straight to curved, as in the Marina Towers and the Accor Tower, which rectifies the problem of blocked views. But since the outdoor spaces overlook each other laterally, whether they are wrapped around a circular plan or aligned linearly, they compromise privacy sideways, as well as from above, since the balconies are stacked on top of one another. A discordance can also exist between the interior layout and the balcony, either because the balconies are identical in size despite differently sized apartments, or because the balcony is curved, whereas the interior is rectilinear. Given the increasing invasion of privacy in our contemporary life, we chose to focus our agency on shifting this convention of outdoor spaces which lack privacy. First, the typical floor plate is pinched, as you see, to divide the balconies of the 4 units, obviating the need for a dividing screen. Then the floor plate is curved so that the balconies would flow more easily around the corner. the floor plates are then rotated relative to the envelope so that it is no longer possible to overlook the neighboring balcony, as seen in these images. In order to reduce the overlooking of balconies vertically, the position of balconies are shifted from one floor to another, and this generates floor plates that are not identical to each other and transmit effects of privacy, diversity, multidirectionality, because the balconies are all in different orientations. It also doubles the vertical distance between the balconies so that the overlooking that conventionally occurs between balconies that are stacked simply on top of each other is minimized, since the balcony below is 2 levels down. To minimize views down even further, the handrail is mobilized as an agent relative to the balconies that are visible 2 floors below, a condition that is found along the red lines of these plans. So the handrail of some of the balconies must generate a gradient of privacy along their length. In a residential building, the handrail must typically perform 2 contradictory roles to allow maximum views out and minimum views in. And in our case, a third one of minimizing views kind of vertically down in some areas. The profile chosen for the handrail supports can play a significant role in performing these roles, as indicated by these 4 scenarios, which have different handrail supports, different sections for the supports, and also different distributions. Views in and out do not vary so much whether the handrail comprises 1 line of support with rectangular profiles or 2 lines of support with circular profiles. But when the 2 lines of support are offset, views in are reduced while views transparency is kept for the views out. And if the spacing of the support is densified, as you see here to the right, the handrail minimizes overlooking down in those areas. This assemblage of floor plates, envelope, and handrails generate 2 types of private balconies: a single-height balcony with an exterior curtain for additional privacy, and a double-height balcony, which is found in different orientations along the height of the building due to the rotation of the balconies, therefore providing many options of outdoor space based on size, shape, type of view, and size, sun exposure. Therefore, approaching the building as an assemblage rather than a unified whole provides its style with different kinds of agencies. The agency to shift people's experience of their interiors from interior-exterior discordance and stuffiness to interior-exterior concordance and cross-ventilation, and the agency to shift the experience of balconies from exposure and homogeneity to extreme privacy and diversity. Now, the building isn't finished yet, so it is impossible to know what impact these effects will have on the people who live in the apartments, but it is inevitable that the encounter between people and a new kind of balcony in an apartment, an extremely open and private space, will prompt creative responses from residents, since there is no precedent for this kind of outdoor space. Now, the style of museums can also call for active participation from people who use them, whereas a primary concern for terminals is getting people from A to B, and perhaps a primary concern for residential buildings is to provide privacy and comfort. The primary practical concern for contemporary art museums is flexibility of the galleries to display changing exhibitions. The White Cube Gallery, because of its total whiteness and separation from the rest of the museum, as well as the exterior, is typically considered the most flexible for changing exhibitions. However, by being self-contained and separated from daily life, it transmits neutrality, atemporality, and acontextuality. And as the museum exterior is disconnected from the experience of the gallery seeing art, it has prompted critics such as Charles Jenks to argue for the style of, for example, this museum through external narratives such as sales or spinnakers, rather than any agency it might otherwise carry vis-a-vis going to see art. Meanwhile, the rest of the museum, given that the galleries are sealed away, is devoid of any art. Now, we designed the Museum of Contemporary Art in Cleveland to shift the convention of the museum as a decorated shed that represents external narratives outside and provides a neutral white cube inside. However, this was not done trying to look for some kind of new unified whole, but an assemblage of elements that act in groups as different agents in order to influence people's experience of the art museum. The envelope and the main stair are the primary agents, and these in themselves are made out of other elements, smaller elements, or small agencies, which is what Darwin would say. The small elements of the envelope include its shape, its entrances, its rain screen cladding, its fireproof paint and structure, and its windows. Its shape generated through a compact hexagonal entry floor rising to a rectangular roof allowed us to locate the building in the corner of the site and leave space for a plaza in front, into which the museum events would spill out in good weather. This shape, which is the second best fit for the corner after a circle, also provides 5 entrances at the different sides, on the different sides of the building, so that it can be subdivided into distinct areas and accessed separately. Therefore, all of the interior on the entry floor, and not just the main gallery, is embedded with hyperflexibility to be configured in different ways over time. At times, these spaces can be used for events, and at other times for multiple simultaneous exhibitions, sometimes with their own door from the street. Such as a space on the entry floor with an entrance to the plaza outside that is assembled with movable shelving so that during the day it hosts the museum store, and at night, it converts into a performance art space. The envelope's shape is also designed to act with its construction layers to generate surprising experiences. Its exterior vented rain screen layer is assembled with black mirror stainless steel strips pressed in the middle, which creates an oil can effect within it, and arranged diagonally across the building's faces. This provides it with a specific phenomenal quality to be simultaneously reflective and absorptive. Therefore, rather than being timeless and separated from daily life, it catches the light and reflections of the physical context of the museum, as well as changing human relations, and generates different unexpected affects. Close up, the cladding strips transmit delay, refraction, compression, refrigeration, displacement, light, and transience. Further away, the rain screen is in combination with the envelope shape transmit different affects depending on the point of view from which it is viewed from. From certain points, solidity and blackness, and from other points, hollowness, tenting as if the separate sides are a house of cards resting one another, and ambiguity. I've been told it was designed to look like a crystal, but its agency lies not in representing any external narrative, but in appearing relational or dialogic rather than detached from its context. Inside, the structural steel decking is another small element of the envelope whose agency has been activated. It is painted in blue fire-resistant paint, since the structure is exposed. Instead of a narrative, the tension between the affect blue on the inside and black on the outside produces the experience of, or the way of entering the museum, which is not like moving between two disconnected states, because since both the black rain screen and the blue structural metal decking follow the same shape, the building retains a sense of surface tension between the inside and the outside of the museum, which the visitors experience upon entering. The blue fire resistance paint performs other functions too. It wraps around and over all of the museum spaces, reinforcing continuity between art and non-art spaces. When it wraps around the main gallery, it subverts the neutrality of the white cube gallery, where art floats and has no weight. The contrast between the dark blue ceiling of the main gallery and the light walls and floor generate an inversion of the gallery interior as exterior, in which the ceiling transmits a sky-like affect of boundlessness, and the space below transmits an affect of weight due to its contrasting brightness. When there is no natural light entering the interior, the dark blue ceiling over the main galleries generates the illusion that the inside is outside and the weight is certainly below on the artwork. Here are portraits of the members of the public on the very first public opening day of the museum. A strong feeling comes across, a kind of enhanced engagement with the art. No one can say that these people are distracted because they are not in a white cube type of gallery. The walls of the gallery are, of course, temporary. The museum sometimes blocks natural light completely when the sense of boundlessness of the ceiling will be more active, and perhaps the space is more passive, and at other times the arrangement of the temporary walls reveals the perimeter blue walls and natural light flows in, and here space becomes more active, engaging with the art. Finally, Mocha's windows form another small element or agent of its envelope. They are arranged as long strips, irrespective of the location of the floors inside, and diagonally orientated, following the orientation of the exterior rain screen cladding. In combination with the envelope shape, they transmit an affect of movement and scalelessness. On the inside, the windows are mobilized to disrupt the assumed incommensurability of the White Cube Gallery interior and exterior, typically celebrated by carefully framed windows. The window reveals are clad in mirror stainless steel to displace the depth of the gallery walls with lateral views of the exterior. This generates new landscapes throughout the day, revealing new relationships. What if a new Frank Gehry building is built facing Mocha? It would be better than the existing car park. What if pedestrian crossings are planned to cross diagonally at the junction of Mayfield and Euclid? They do this in Tokyo, and it avoids waiting twice behind slow lights to cross a junction. The mirror reveals are therefore an act in which the inside and the outside, rather than being presented as two separate realities to gallery visitors, are intertwined, generating an affect of temporality. The stair is another agent in changing the conventional museum experience. It is designed to provide access, but also to subvert the typical separation between art and non-art spaces, as well as the linearity of typical museum stairs. What appears as a single stair is in fact a double-decker stair, an open stair stacked on top of one of the egress stairs to save space initially, but we found out that it can also be a way to provide not just one route to climb the museum floors, but 10 open and closed routes, which could then be also intertwined with art. The enclosed egress route, here in yellow, is designed as a sound gallery, shifting the idea that an egress stair is only used in the case of emergencies. It is painted yellow to dematerialize the sense of space and generate affects of weightlessness and scalelessness to focus the attention on sound. While the upper route is designed with wide landings to act both as a social space as well as performance space. The museum uses this in this way too. The stair is extended above the top floor gallery to enable visitors to look inside the gallery when it is closed for setting up of exhibitions, thus expanding the perception of the museum as a space of display to include the production of exhibitions too. I think we can conclude that the specific arrangements of Mocha's elements, its stair and envelope entrances, rain screen cladding, and interior fireproof paint define its style, trajectory, or we could say elan, as a museum, a contemporary art museum that transmits flexibility, temporality, transience, boundlessness, scalelessness, relationality, and dialogism. Now, this is the Victoria Beckham flagship store, where we were asked to design the store on 3 floors of an existing building. I think it exemplifies the agency of affects on a much smaller scale. Project. Like most brands, Victoria Beckham has an online shopping platform. So this project raised the following question for us. How can style or the arrangement of its shopfront, floors, stairs, display systems generate a site-specific shopping experience? The shopfront is usually arranged as a display space, separate from the interior, which, as in a market, focuses on transmitting choice, with display systems that transmit permanence and predictability over time. To shift the customer's experience of shopping away from these conventions, we focused on these various elements that we could play with as the designers of the store, as well as people's perception, as material that would generate a variety of experiential moments and invite the customers to interact with the store in different ways over time, like different propositions. The shop front is designed as a window, partially in glass and partially in a concrete sash window, with no merchandise on display, so it would function with the space inside and activate the sense of the store from the exterior, less like a market and more like a gallery. When customers approach the concrete window, they're presented with the surprise that what appeared as a sash window that usually slides up and down is in fact a sliding door that effortlessly slides to one side. The accessory wall for handbags immediately behind the shop front is designed to change the perception of this space over time. Its long shelves are retractable to allow the store to vary the amount of shelves and handbags. on display or to completely remove them to allow the space to be used for other events. The ceiling is clad in mirror stainless steel, so it would draw customers to view the top of the handbags that are reflected in it, which is often the most interesting, and to create a virtual double of the space. People are engaged in the process of working out where exactly is the actual ceiling line and how tall is the space in actuality. 2 staircases connect the levels below and above. Their opening is intentionally arranged smaller than the stairs, generating a partial ceiling over the stair that shows everything upside down and provides uneven headroom. This alters people's perception of the staircase as merely practical. The stair is a room of its own, in which accessories, clothing, and different artworks are displayed over time. Meanwhile, the ceiling of the floor above, seen here to the right, is designed as a lightweight concrete coffered ceiling. Here we can clearly see the process of appropriation, in this case the coffered ceiling, a convention of the modern art gallery, shifted to function in a retail space while providing affects of a contemporary art gallery. It engages customers in a sense of upward expansion when they enter from the level below and conceals the mechanical and electrical system, but more importantly, it shifts the usual clothing display fixed to the floor to a hung system of chains that can be moved to different locations, like movable walls in a gallery, or entirely removed to convert the space into an event space. This alliance between the hanging system and the ceiling has other implications in the shopping experience. Typically, customers must use 2 hands to view the clothing, abandoning their handbag on the ground, which soon can lead to an awkward situation. The chain system allows customers to rotate the clothing 360 degrees using 1 hand. It transmits playfulness and interactivity, challenging the convention of the shop as simply a market focused on choice. To further make the perception of shopping site-specific, the counters for folded clothing and small accessories are designed in mirror stainless steel, so to turn them from floating objects to objects that are immersed in their environment. Consequently, the experience of shopping, for example, for knitwear or small accessories is inseparable from the space that surrounds them. And to further liberate customers from predictability, the seating in the store is designed as a system of triangular benches that can be combined in different ways and be moved around the store so that they can be encountered in different ways over different visits to the store. So when you come into the store, something you may have taken for granted, the usual displays and focus on choice of merchandise starts to lose its ground. You have to find what the shop is and how you behave in it. Just to finish, this is 130 Fenchurch Street, a 17-story mid-rise office tower we are working on currently, located within the eastern cluster of tall buildings in London, an area which fosters, as I'm sure you know, urban synergy or knowledge spillover between different financial trading firms, formally or informally. This means that the public realm between the buildings is in intense use as traders move between headquarters. So the project raised 2 questions for us. How should the building articulate its presence as an object of encounter for passers-by for whom the practical functions of the interior is not of concern? And given that work is increasingly defined by digital technology, how can the physical space of work make a contribution to it? Now, to address these 2 questions, we had to identify the elements that would relate to each one of them and the coefficients that they, individually or together, produce. The massing and the curtain wall of an office building are the agents determining its exterior presence by day. For example, the massing could imply that the rays of sunlight are directed towards people's cars, parked nearby, as in the case of the building to the left, or the massing could benefit the rights of light of neighboring streets, neighboring buildings and streets, as in the case of the building to the right. I'm sure you know them. On the interior, the relationship between the core and the structure relates to the flexibility of its occupancy pattern. The combination of the central core and the exoskeletal structure in 30 St. Mary's Axe, which is on top, provides less flexibility than the combination of the external core and exoskeletal structure of 122 Leaden's Hall seen to the bottom. So it makes a huge difference. And the relationship between the structure and the curtain wall relates to the transparency of the workplace and the flexibility of the space planning as indicated by these different kinds of interiors. Just like a residential project, the building can neither be governed by a single unifying idea, nor can it be reduced to independent elements or discrete elements. It must be conceived as an assemblage in which elements, by virtue of their grouping and location, develop different emergent properties. The other advantage of this approach to style is that the different elements can continue to develop over a longer period of time if needed. For example, the core of our building is still being developed, as well as many other parts of it that we have not worked on yet. We began by addressing the presence of the building in the city, since this is first needed in order to obtain planning approval from the City of London Corporation. Most mid-rise buildings in the area have a stepped massing, as you see here, to disguise their scale from the street level. But there is no need to disguise the massing of the building on Fenchurch Street, since Fenchurch Street is continuously bending and narrow, so the building mass will always be seen partially along the approaching streets anyway. So since stepping would have almost no effect on passers-by, our massing strategy is based on pure extrusion, and therefore the element that will have agency in shaping people's encounter of the building will be its curtain wall. Conventionally, curtain walls are assembled independent of the load-bearing structure in order to appear transparent. Yet, they are never fully transparent, except perhaps at night, because the curtain wall includes horizontal and vertical caps or mullions, silicone joints and expansion joints, as well as different shading devices, which appear darker than glass. Consequently, a grid appears, which transmits affects of efficiency, which belongs perhaps more to the tailor's days than today's workplace. During the day, the glass curtain wall is reflective, which is meant to integrate the presence of the building into its context by mirroring it, but instead generates a sense of anonymity and disappearance in the building. We wanted to shift the presence of 130 Fenchurch Street in the city away from these conventions of transmitting efficiency, anonymity, and disappearance, which are not desirable any longer in the 21st century work environment. Therefore, firstly, rather than assembling its curtain wall with flat pieces of glass, it is assembled with concave ones, as you see here, which are varied in scale to accommodate the irregularities of the site footprint, but also, more importantly, to generate variety in people's experience as they pass around the building. The building's location is such that, almost every side of it has people passing by. Secondly, the curved glass panels are assembled with a structurally glazed reveal, replacing the conventional appearance of frames with a shadow reveal. Instead of simply mirroring its context, the fluted curtain wall will compress reflections of the context into each one of its segments, and new images will emerge. Thirdly, in order to simplify the color tonal range of the reflections into a subtle gradation of tones, the glass will be frit to appear black, similar to black glass used by painters in the 18th and the 19th century to turn from geometric to physiological optics. The black frit will not only reduce the tonality of reflections and the reflective qualities of glass, it will also absorb the dark shadows of the glass panels in between them, turning the repeated images into a continuity. The tighter the fluting, the finer will be the grain of the image. The variation of the curtain wall, as well as the simplicity of the extruded shape, will be at odds with its neighbors or their sculptural nearby high-rises, and will engage passers-by to explore all of its sides as they move past the building, whilst its serrated edge at the top will reinforce the building's presence and distinction against the sky. Here, their focus will be lifted upwards. Unlike a conventional glass curtain wall that almost disappears against the sky, the cluster of affects of presence and multiplicity, verticality and fluting, serration and fluidity are very different to affects of rigidity, stepping, stacking, flatness, absence, and uniformity experienced in the buildings immediately next door. This affective break will surprise people and invite them to make sense of the building. On the interior, the curtain wall of a mid-rise building, as seen in these images, remains present, but its agency resides in the type of alliance it forms with the building structure to define greater or lesser flexibility for the workspaces. The structural frame of a mid-rise tower is conventionally designed at 9-meter spacing. At this span, the columns, as you see, these kind of circular columns, or clad columns, at this span, the columns are very large, which is a challenge for office partitioning. Instead, we have designed the structural columns at 3-meter spacing, so they would appear as part of the curtain wall. At this span, the columns are substantially smaller and fit within the depths of the curvature of the curtain wall. This frees up area otherwise used by structure, but also optimizes the interior for partitions, if needed. In addition, the 3-meter spacing of columns perform like interior brise-soleil along the west facades by stopping the afternoon sun coming in at low level and therefore avoiding glare in the workplaces. The alliance between the structure and the curtain wall, however, has emergent aesthetic implications too. Inside, the conventional 9-meter spacing here places the emphasis on structure, whereas the even distribution of columns at 3-meter spacing places the emphasis on space. And outside, instead of large columns at 9-meter centers and the floor slabs, the presence of the smaller columns at 3-meter spacing dissolve behind the recessed mullions. Along the street views, the depth of the columns will partially interrupt the views in. The center of each glass panel, marked in red on this plan, is where there will be clear views of the interior from the exterior. With this in mind, the black frit is graduated from densest at the edges that sit in front of the structure to total transparency in the center. This is half of one of the modules of glass. For the interior views out, the black color of the frit has the advantage that physiologically the human eye is trained to focus on light colors, and therefore the eye will see straight through the frit and when viewing to the outside. On the exterior, the dense frit along the edges of each glass panel will absorb both the shadow structural reveals as well as the presence of the columns on oblique views, and it will generate dark vertical shadows in each glass flute, transmitting verticality. In contrast to the dark vertical shadows, the presence of the floor spanderos recede and the tower will transmit scalelessness. By the day, the space between the passers-by and the curtain wall will therefore be constantly active. The passers-by eyes will be drawn to search across the surface of the curtain wall for the source of its dramatic vertiginous effect, only to discover that there is no place for it to rest on. And it is in this act of assembling elements in a coherent way so that they would co-function to generate novel affects without any attempt at communicating their practical functions that the style of the curtain wall will be free from representational as well as practical functions of the offices to instead engage people's actual perception on the exterior. At night, the exterior presence of an office building is defined by its structure and the ceilings that become visible. Here are office buildings, nearby our site, which by the day are designed to be distinct, you could say unique, from one another, but at night it is hard to tell one from the other as they all use the same ceiling system. To shift the perception of the building we are designing away from this now generic condition, we are focusing on the ceilings and how they perform as part of the building at night. Instead of using typical ceiling tiles, or I should say square tiles, we are proposing to use a linear baffle system that can be sourced actually in a standard way, and that can also integrate the coefficients of lighting and accessibility to services. However, we are exploring also an uneven spacing between them as a way to create the illusion of pleating to the ceiling at the scale of the column grid. The ceiling would then transmit rhythm and movement rather than flatness. From the exterior, looking up at the ceiling at night, the conjunction of the horizontals of the floor slabs that become now visible and the diagonals of the ceiling will produce an entirely new form that disrupts this anonymity and disappearance transmitted by the ceilings of the neighboring office buildings. This could not be predetermined. We had to find it during the process. As I mentioned, the project is ongoing, but I think the project already shows that what might seem as a very limited beginning, a curved glazed profile can become a fertile ground for many other affects because it is very neutral and you can work into it and work into it and work into it to group it simultaneously with other elements to make it perform in many, many different ways. Accordingly, each element of the building is simultaneously one thing and several things. It is neither subservient to a single fundamental idea, nor is it seen by itself. It is always affected by other elements, and the agency or freedom of the architect consists in moving about within this narrow frame to find opportunities for shifting conventions, to free people from everydayness and routine, no matter what the scale of these shifts are. So now, having defined style for you and its agency, I would like to very briefly look at some of the projects featured in the style book, which in a way go beyond our own immediate projects. It is important to note that the book does not propose that architects today share a style, but that consciously or unconsciously they share an approach to style. I think this is quite important to note. It brings together projects from two time frames, the early 20th century and the period from the 1990s to the present, and highlights their similarities in the way they are arranged. These projects at first glance might not appear similar, but by drawing them in grayscale, where superficial differences such as colors and textures are suppressed, similarities in organization become apparent. While to highlight the style that the style of these buildings is intimately bound with everyday life, rather than to the representation of the building's, let's say, time of origin, nationality of author, the projects are grouped according to the everyday life activities that they host. So they are grouped according to buildings for working, buildings for residing, buildings for shopping. Identifying these differences or shifts made by architects, or what Rancière calls the census, highlights where architects have made micropolitical choices and exercise their agency to provide people with new ways of engaging with certain aspects of their everyday life activities. This involves appropriating conventions of arrangement established by other projects, by other architects in different locations, and shifting them in order to create new affects. For example, the residential building to the right by changing the grouping, size, and shape of elements that define the border of apartments and the corridor in the building to the left shifts people's experience of entering the apartments from enclosure and interiority to exposure and exteriority. Now, here are two buildings for learning. The building to the left is arranged with a perimeter load-bearing concrete wall to provide flexibility within the learning spaces. Its structural perimeter wall is pierced evenly, with narrow windows to insulate the learning spaces visually and acoustically. Therefore, it transmits affects of homogeneity and introversion. While the building to the right also appropriates the idea of the perimeter wall being structural, but to overcome introversion and homogeneity, it pierces the wall with varying sized windows, which result in differentiation and porosity in the learning spaces. Or here are two buildings for viewing exhibitions. The one on the left assembles the galleries with vaulted ceilings into which natural light diffuses through an opening at the apex of the vaults. The building to the right appropriates this same convention of arranging the galleries with as vaulted spaces, but shifts the way the light is introduced, thereby altering the convention associated with viewing of art. Each time, the architect appropriates conventions set by another project, which is inevitable today, and shifts it, abandoning the pursuit of style as a tool for representation of autonomous perfection, formal originality, idealist macro-scale solutions such as unity, to instead embrace micropolitics of everyday life. By shifting conventions, each project creates the possibility for something new to appear in the encounter between people and their everyday activities, so that they would be able to discard habits of use that seem inevitable. For example, FOA's Caravanchel to the right has appropriated conventions from the Mies van der Rohe's Wiesenhof-Siedlung to the left. Both of them are slab buildings with no internal corridor, introducing many more vertical cores so that every two units would share a core, providing them with a very small landing and therefore affects of privacy, extreme privacy. However, in Caravanchel, the arrangement of balconies, as you see here to the right, is very different to the Wiesenhof. They run along the entire length of the apartment. The glazing is floor to ceiling height, as opposed to the Wiesenhof, where that only happens at the point of the balcony. And also the balconies are provided with bamboo shutters, which provides them with extra privacy, and therefore the effects of uniformity, interiority, and exposure that are experienced in this balcony are entirely changed to, in the case of Carabanchel. The Johnson Bax headquarters and Shanghai Tower are also two buildings that are related but different in the way they introduce peripheral atriums in office towers. The one on the left, as in the case of the Johnson Bax, tries to develop the idea of the side atriums by stacking a circular and a rectangular floor plate. We see here that there is a kind of a beginning of visual interaction between floors, but it's not an area where you can occupy. In the Shanghai Tower, the peripheral atriums are repeated every 12 to 15 floor plates, and therefore 9 times along the height of the building. Therefore, their scale is significantly different. Their shape is significantly different. But most importantly, glass is introduced between the workspaces and the space of the atrium, and therefore the atrium develops autonomy of its own and privacy, and therefore it generates also the possibility of interaction between workers. The projects analyzed in the book demonstrate, I think, that ever since the 1990s, architects' shared approach to style, consciously or unconsciously, has been to engage the micropolitics of everyday life through process of differentiation, to change people's perception of their everyday life activities, rather than to represent themselves, their origin, their time where they're practicing, or their nationality. The larger consequence of this approach to style, as I hope these slides show, is not incoherent diversity, but the diversity underlying which there is a network of projects which are related to one another, but discontinuous with each other at the same time. And as a result, the field of contemporary architecture has become an intricate network of style, developing like a rhythm, not from a single origin or towards a single end, but from the middle, from different strands of thoughts that have come to existence from early 20th century or perhaps even before. Thank you. I am going to leave these running in case you have any questions, and they will run by themselves, hopefully.
Does anyone have any questions for Farshid?
I saw it in here.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much for taking on a sort of world tour of architecture that, for me, in a way, resembles. It seems to what you're suggesting is that there's no identity anymore in terms of style, and we seem to have a kind of universal language. The question I have is, what the differences in cultural identities seems to be disappearing, and all of the presentation here sort of demonstrates that. Is the importance of this cultural identity for different regions, different cultures, different ways of life no longer relevant in the 21st century?
Okay, I think it's a good question. First of all, I disagree with you that these projects are all the same. I am encouraging you to find the scale, to look at the way they're different. So they're not all the same. We've been defining, if previously we were defining styles through kind of formalism, well, we've had, forms that are curvy, forms that are more rectangular, rectilinear, forms that are more simple or more chaotic. I think you will find them all in here. I think that there is a significant amount of difference between the practices that are presented here. So I don't think they're the same. In terms of cultural identity, I think architecture doesn't let's say, there is a limit to what architecture does. What I think is interesting is to work with cultural differences, but to the extent that they exist, rather than to fabricate differences artificially. Now, it just happens that we live in a world where we share a lot. And there is a lot of similarity between places, but I think there are also differences, and that's what makes us all curious to travel and to visit other places. And it is up to each architect to work and emphasize to greater or lesser extent these differences. What I'm offering here is not how to make a style, but not what that style is that would exclude or include those differences, but to argue that architecture as a discipline actually has its own means to create difference and to promote the idea that these differences should be, let's say, targeted or aimed at engaging with people's everyday life rather than for the sake of representing myself as a great architect or, my client as being a great client, etc.
Other questions? Well, I have a question which is about your practice and sort of style within your practice. And I wanted to ask you how you test the role of effect in elements you select for your projects, whether you make lots of one-to-one prototypes or if it's computer visualizations. How do you sort of test those amazing effects that you explore in your work?
I mean, first of all, I think I don't want affect to be understood as being only to do with the physical material. So arrangement of let's say, configurational, orders of a room also generate affect. This room has a certain affect. I've been ignoring people on this side because I've been looking at, but actually it's quite it has a different effect to a typical linear arrangement. So, but in terms of materials, we try to go back and forth between, images these days that you can use quite effectively to simulate between models, we don't make models so much for their shape because you do that quicker on the computer, but to test and approximate colors and textures and those things that are to do with the real experience, which of course will never be real. There is a certain amount of guesswork.
So can I ask another question, if that's okay?
Yeah, of course.
I've just had an opportunity to visit the I Wear Ways exhibition today, and some of the themes that he touches on, this question of in the architecture he's looked at, or he does, he touches on the themes of the idea of sort of simplicity, in a way, legibility, question of scale, question of light. How does that sort of come into this sort of methodology that you've been discussing here? For example, the question of scale, the question of sort of controlled light, the question of materiality. Are these sort of issues relevant or important in the way?
Well, I mean, every project has its own particularities. Scale and light, I would have thought, is part of every single project. But of course, if you're designing a gallery, that has a collection, it's even more important. I try to. Sometimes I worry that this way of explaining the projects, elementally is a bit tedious. But what I'm trying to explain is that architecture has its own politics. There is a lot of interest in thinking about the relevance of architecture, beyond itself, and we often forget that ultimately, no matter what ambition you have, we have our own tools, and it's only through those tools and at the scale of architecture that we ultimately can shape things. And so, you can work with light, you can work with the number of entrances to a building, you can work certainly with scale, you can work with whether a building provides, what level of thermal comfort it makes. These are all the different, if you like, elements and coefficients of a building, and they would be part of this process. I mean, the reason why I mixed projects of the office with the style book is because with the style book you don't see that process. So I tried to somehow add it and to explain that, of course, each one of these projects has a you know, a rich and twisted journey of becoming what it is. We just don't see that. Here we are trying to just assess the result and see if, whether this whole investigation by architects in the last, 2 decades is mindless, you know, kind of commitment to the market and external forces, or whether architects are actually doing something a little bit more, with a little bit more insight. Now, I am not saying that all of the architects in the style book are agree with me or are aware of this process, but I'm interested in promoting this way of thinking. I am interested in, and I think certainly myself, since I've become aware of it, I work with it. So for example, the Carabanchel building of FOA, when we did it, we were never aware of the Mies building, but I'm interested in that relationship now. And so now that we are working on a project in France, and somehow it has evolved out of Carabanchel, I like to think about what it shares with it so that I focus on being different also as a way to innovate. I am interested in this way of thinking. You know, it's, but I think it's a scenario that one could see in the projects.
Like you said, digital networks have overtaken every facet of life and have diminished the relevance of geographical locations. So how do you think that people can create a sense of place for themselves in such a situation?
By asking an architect to design them a wonderful, specific building for that site with a particular set of activities inside, using very specific materials that are different to the buildings next door. That's what you do.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you so much, Farshid. I think we should wrap up now. That was really inspiring lecture.
Thank you.
So
Thank you. Thank you.